Hey, Hywel here. Right, what I want to do today is a talk on the Hyksos, the Hyksosian invasion of Egypt and their legacy. So I'm going to be looking at the possible connection between the Hyksos and the Israelites. I'm going to be looking at their invasion of Egypt and their legacy. So we don't know much about the Hyksos before they invaded Egypt, and their legacy is also mysterious. I mean, the history of the legacy is a mystery in itself. So we're looking at the period 1638 to 1550 BC, roughly. And it was Josephus who said that the Hyksos were the shepherd kings. That was the shepherd kings. But many people have said it's not a particularly good translation or way of describing them, because they were anything but peaceful shepherds. They were quite brutal and they were quite violent. And Michael Tazarian has looked at whether the word shepherd there is a reference to stars, like a connection between astrotheology. But ruler of foreign lands is the preferred translation or way of describing the Hyksos. Now, as I said, we don't know much about their origin. We don't know much about their legacy, and even their occupation of Egypt is a mystery, because the Egyptians tried to sort of erase them from history, as they did with Akhenaten. But one of the main researchers I looked in to use for this was Ralph Ellis, and he says that if you look at the architecture that they left behind in Egypt, it's more akin to North Levant or Northern Levant. And despite the fact that they had adopted the traditions and the culture of ancient Egypt, I mean, for example, they had their own pharaoh system, they were resented by the local population, and so whoever was going to expel them was going to be a hero. Now, first we have Kamoses in the 17th dynasty, and then we have Atmosis in the 18th dynasty in the 1550s, who became the hero, the man behind the expulsion of the Hyksos. However, when we look at it closely, we find that the Hyksos were never fully expelled. They were never fully expelled. They were probably, many of them were expelled to remote areas in Egypt, as I'll go into later. Now, one of the reasons that Ralph Ellis says that the Hyksos were the ancient Israelites is because Josephus, Josephus being the main historian of the Jewish people in that sort of post-Christ period, he said they were the Israelites, but he also said they were the Israelites, the Ishmaelites, the Arabs. They had curly side locks. They were circumcised. They had a king called Jacob or Jacoba. I mean, I've seen pictures of the ancient Israelites, the ancient Hyksos, that look like Israelites. But, what they were doing is that they had invaded Egypt in the Delta area, exploiting a weakness, because Egypt was very divided at that time. And the Delta area, what we call Lower Egypt in the north, was particularly weak. And so their original takeover was quite bloodless. But it wasn't long before they started to enslave the population and destroy cities and destroy temples, and became extremely resented, leading to their expulsion. Now, Manetho, I think he is a sort of wrote in the BC period, the immediate BC period, and he says that they were expelled to the Levant, where they destroyed Jericho and founded Jerusalem. And Josephus also said that they founded Jerusalem. But if you look at more modern research material, if you've got, like, for example, just going on Wikipedia, you'll find that Wikipedia says that there's no archaeological evidence that they were ever expelled to the Levant. Now, I'm pretty sure that they became very fragmented, and they were dispersed within Egypt as well as outside. And I think that they left behind a legacy. And Akhenaten of the 18th dynasty, the 1330s, is possibly part Hyksosian. He's probably a part of that Hyksosian expulsion, Hyksosian legacy. And Akhenaten being the founder, he's a pharaoh, and he was one of the founders of monotheism, the founding father of monotheism, and his life story is very similar to Moses. And its researchers like Ahmad Osman will say that the Akhenaten actually is Moses. The Moses story is fictitious, and it's based on the real life of Akhenaten. And then we've got Akhenaten being Aten, the sun god. So we've got Aton, Ardon, Adon, Adonai being one of the god names of the Old Testament. One of the god names of the Old Testament. And then we've got the hymn to Aton, which is so similar to Psalms 104. There. And remember that what Ralph Ellis does is he looks at the biblical story of the Exodus, which is not an expulsion of Moses and his people, of Moses and the Israelites, and says that this could be the combination of three events. So first we've got Santonini. So we've got the volcano, the earthquake, the tsunami, the parting of the sea, and 3 days of darkness, up towards Greece and Crete. We've got the expulsion of the Hyksos in the 1550s, and then we've got the expulsion of Akhenaten in the 1330s. So those three events form the basis, the origin of the biblical story of Moses and the Exodus. Now, remember that Moses first flees because he has killed an Egyptian, and he fears for his life. So he flees into the Midian area. Now, this is relevant to where I'm going next. He flees into the Midian, where he meets a Midian called Jethro, and then Jethro offers his daughter Zipporah, who's obviously a Midian, to Moses, and Moses marries a Midianite. And then Moses goes back, and then we get that whole "let my people go" story. And then Moses then flees. He's not expelled. And the Egyptian army with their chariots are chasing them to bring them back, because they're freeing themselves from captivity. Now, what I want to do now is move on to a possible legacy of the Hyksos. So I've looked at the connection between the Hyksos and the Israelites, and whether Akhenaten, who was a founding father of monotheism, and may well be the origin of the story of Moses, and then looking at whether the Hyksos then fled eventually into the Midian area. Okay, now there's a book by Laurent Guyon, I'm not pronouncing his name right, who is a French writer. He wrote a book called "Your God is Our God, but He has Chosen Us," or something like that. And there's a really fascinating chapter in it called "The Volcano God." Okay, the volcano God. So what he's doing here, he's looking at Moses, as I said, flees from Egypt into the Midian area, in very near Mount Horeb. Okay, now what we have to understand there is we've got the Septuagint confusion. Okay, so let me explain the Septuagint. The Septuagint is the 3rd century BC. 72 scholars. Okay, remember, you've got 72 God names in the Old Testament. You've got 72 under the direction of autonomy, so there's politics involved everywhere. Their job was to translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and all of them were isolated from each other so that they couldn't influence each other, and all of them came up with exactly the same translation, but they all made the same mistake of the Red Sea should have been the Sea of Reeds. So in Hebrew it's clearly the Sea of Reeds, and then it becomes, they translate it into the Red Sea. Okay, and it's still there today. It's still there in English translations today, and it's a well-known mistake. And so we know that they didn't flee across the Red Sea. They must have gone round the top of the Sinai and down into the Midian. And the Sea of Reeds does imply fresh, shallow water. Okay, good. And the wadis of Midian, and that's where Moses first hears Yahweh's voice. And so, if I read from his book here, it's got Mount Horeb, which is Mount Sinai. That's the same mountain. Sounds like a volcano, smokes and rumbles like a volcano. By implication, it should be one. So he concludes that the Sinai is in the Midian in northwest Arabia. If I can just quickly show you what I mean. If I go right up close like that, can you see that's the Sinai Peninsula there? Okay, so we're going from Egypt here, okay, and a possible journey is across the Sinai Peninsula into the Midian. And remember that when Moses goes back, here. Is that right? Is that? Let me get that right. Yeah, that's Egypt. So the Midian is like here, and that's Palestine up here where my finger is. When Moses goes back, and it's clearly a volcanic area. When Moses goes back, and then he flees with his people chased by the chariots, he's going back to a very similar area because he's going back to an area near Mount Horeb. And everything about that story implies some kind of Vulcan god, a volcano god. If I read from Galatians 4:25, Paul the Apostle knew that the Sinai mountain was a mountain in Arabia. And then if you look in the Israeli occupation of the Sinai, I was in the Sinai in the 87, and it was anything but a volcanic area. The Sinai Peninsula I'm talking about. And between 67 and 82, I think it is, the Israelis occupied the Sinai Peninsula. And it led many fruitless archaeological digs looking for the biblical story. And so they were left to search elsewhere. And then it's got in Exodus 3:16, it's got the God of your ancestors has appeared to me. So that's Moses talking to his people. And Laurent Guyon says it's not clear who God is referring to. Is he referring to the Midianites or the Hebrews? But what it is quite clear that that's holy ground for the Midianites of Western Arabia. As I said, that area above Medina and Mecca, below Aqaba. And we know that the Midianite god, one of the Midianite gods, was a classic Vulcan god, a volcano god. And then Yahweh then mutates into an omnipotent God. So he has to send an angel with Moses towards the land of Canaan. But he slowly mutates into this invisible, omnipotent God that can be seen everywhere. And remember that Akhenaten, who probably lays the foundation for this, his God was Aten, the sun, and the sun being the most omnipotent, I always get trouble pronouncing that word, omnipotent phenomenon in the physical world, because it's there every single day. And then centuries later, Elijah embarks on a 40-day pilgrimage to Mount of God, Horeb, where hurricanes, eruptions and earthquakes take place, and Elijah receives God's word. Can Yahweh's lust for carbonized flesh, I'm reading this from his book, be ascribed to his volcanic home? And in Deuteronomy, Yahweh is described as a consuming fire. And then in Malachi, he glows like a furnace, set ablaze all evildoers. Fear of Yahweh, fear of brimstone, and fear of brimstone, the foundation of Judaism. Yahweh's name is not to be uttered. Yahweh's name is not to be uttered. So what I'm doing here is I'm making a connection between the Hyksos and the ancient Israelites. And I'm not making this up. Ralph Ellis, many researchers, Josephus, have made this connection before. I'm not drawing any conclusions. And that they weren't dispersed in this black and white simplistic way. They were dispersed internally within Egypt. And they left behind a legacy. Akhenaten was probably part Hyksosian. He's one of the founding fathers of monotheism, and there you can see the beginning of the story of Judaism beginning. And then what they do is, if you follow the journey that Moses makes in the Old Testament, and remember, I believe that Moses is a fictitious figure based on historical figures, and you understand that the Septuagint Red Sea is a mistranslation of the Sea of Reeds, you can see that the journey is, as I said, it goes across the top of the Sinai, because he ends up in this area in Transjordan, or south of Transjordan, and then they're in what is clearly a volcanic area, and so the nearest to that would be the Midian, and it actually does say the Midian, Mount Horeb, and so that's a possible legacy of the Hyksos. And I'm well aware, this is another video, I'm well aware of the whole Bible comes from Arabia, Western Arabia. Kamal Sahlabi wrote a book called The Bible Comes from Arabia. Ashrash Ezat wrote a book called Egypt Knew No Pharaohs or Israelites. I'm very aware of that, but that's another video, because that throws a complete curveball. I'll go into it briefly, but that throws a complete curveball over what I've just talked about, because for example, it looks at why is the river Nile not in the Hebrew Bible? In Hebrew, you'll find it in English. It says that the river, or the river of Misraim, which is the word that they use. Egypt is a translation of Misraim, which they believe isn't referring to Egypt, but that's another video. So that concludes my talk on the origins and the Hyksosian occupation, invasion of Egypt, and their possible legacy. And thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much.